Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Prime Minister 24, Robert Peel. Bobby. Hello and welcome to this episode of Long History. This is another episode of our series Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, where we literally take a Prime Minister at random and ask a series of questions such as what was he like, how did he get into office, and what were his main achievements in office. Along the way, we also like to paint a little picture of the time. So if you want to find out more about the man who gave his name to the police force, listen on. And if you'd like to listen to more similar episodes, and we've already covered many Prime Ministers now here on Long History, so feel free to explore your podcast provider or to visit longhistory.net, our website, which contains over 350 episodes now. This is Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 24, Robert Peel. Bobby. Robert Peel is one of the most famous, in fact is quite probably the most famous of the 19th century Prime Ministers. He's synonymous with the word Bobby. Indeed, he is the original Bobby, who the police are named after. He's one of only two Prime Ministers who can count himself to be a Victorian and a pre-Victorian PM, along with William Lamb. Ultimately, he is most famous for setting up the police service as we know it, scratched just slightly deeper, however, and he is revealed to be a much more consequential politician than even this fame suggests. He can be said to have created the template for modern politics in Britain. The details, of course, are arguable, but he was responsible, for example, for establishing the Conservative Party even in its present-day form, with a philosophy that's been handed down to today. In this episode, we'll look in particular at what he did to establish a specifically Conservative Party, and what that meant. What was Robert Peel like? He was one of the great reforming PMs, but as a person he was more respected than loved. Peel seems to have been a bit of an awkward character, not a charmer, for example, with some descriptions even saying that this great reformer was actually quite boring. From this perspective, it's no surprise that such a conservative man would establish the basis for the Conservative Party. Descriptions of him make him sound like a serious, driven man with strong beliefs. As a young man, he has been described as admirable, and in terms that at least make him seem handsome. But in 1839, when he was 51 and had just become Prime Minister for the second time, Queen Victoria seemed to take against this seriousness, finding him quite cold, in contrast with the patrician geniality of his predecessor, William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne. It's interesting to note also that despite being one of the great reforming Prime Ministers, commentators complained that he had no original ideas, but rather he used the ideas of others. Where other people came up with these thoughts, however, he put them into practice. He married Julia Floyd in 1820 and went on to have 7 children with her. What was the historical background to Peel's premiership? Peel was born during the times of the French Revolution, and this cast a long shadow over British politics, and particularly over a set of conservative views that wanted to make sure that such a set of events could not be repeated in the UK. In the 1830s, the Whig Party under Earl Grey, had implemented the Great Reform Act, extending the right to vote beyond just the aristocracy to include members of the middle class. This Great Reform Act at the time unleashed further appetite for change. Chartism was the buzzword, and this emerged in the 1830s, asking for more reforms, including votes for all men over 21. Peel's policies very much reacted to this Chartism movement. Robert Peel's rise to power reflects the growing importance of one particular region of England during the Industrial Revolution, Lancashire. Peel was in fact the first of 3 Lancastrian Prime Ministers during the Industrial Revolution's main period, which shadowed the Victorian era. What was happening in the US at the time? Robert Peel actually had 2 premierships, and Andrew Jackson was the president during Peel's first brief term in office. John Tyler and James K. Polk in the meantime were presidents during his second term. Florida entered the Union during Peel's premiership in March 1845, along with Texas at the end of December of the same year. Who could vote? Here on Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week, we like to ask who could vote in every episode to trace the development of democracy in the country. And to a certain extent, democracy in the UK can be defined as being before the Great Reform Act and after the Great Reform Act. And Robert Peel became Prime Minister just after the Reform Act had been enacted. It gave the vote to a wider slice of men in society, but there were very well-defined limits to these voting rights. As well as being men, voters, for example, had to be landowners or paying a yearly rent of £10. They had to be a tenant farmer or a shopkeeper. The changes were more wide-ranging than that, however. 67 new constituencies were created at the time, giving representation to the burgeoning industrial cities on a par with their populations for the first time. Further significant reforms would not take place until 1868, when all working-class men would, at last, be given the vote. What was Robert Peel's background? He was born in Bury on the 15th of February 1788. That's a small town to the north of Manchester in the northwest of England, and his father's fortune was very much made due to the burgeoning industry of the time, cotton. At the turn of the 1800s, for example, Peel's father had been one of only 10 known millionaires in England. This, in turn, gave Peel, the future Prime Minister, a privileged position to view the best and the worst of the Industrial Revolution in action. At that time, the very point of the Industrial Revolution was being discussed. Was it really improving people's lives? And would it perhaps be better just to try and put the horse back in the stable, even though it's already bolted? Robert Peel's father had ambitions for his son, and so sent him to Harrow School, one of the establishment's favourites, with 7 Prime Ministers having attended here. Peel was then one of the 30 Prime Ministers to be educated at Oxford. That's at the time of writing this episode. After university, Peel's father went on to buy him a seat in Parliament, which was quite possible at that time, as it was before that crucial year 1832, when these so-called rotten boroughs, the ones which could be bought in this way, were abolished. Now in government, from 1812 Peel was given the responsibility for the administration of Ireland, where the pressing need to maintain stability in the face of a recalcitrant population reinforced those conservative opinions, where the current system was to be maintained at all costs, learning the same lessons he had learned from his views of the French Revolution. These views would eventually, in 1829, when Peel was in the Home Office, lead to him creating this police force, who would go on to be given his name, Bobby. How did Robert Peel become Prime Minister? Peel's predecessor as leader of the Conservative Party was one of the most famous people from the early 1800s, Arthur Wellesley, otherwise known as the Duke of Wellington. Although he'd been a famous soldier, he hadn't proved quite so popular as a Prime Minister. Arthur Wellesley had misread the public mood, and his government was forced out in 1830 after a series of protests threatened the country's stability. 2 years later, when that Great Reform Act was implemented, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was still the leader of the Tory party. The Tory party, which was also Robert Peel's party, opposed this Great Reform Act. They had their reasons, thinking the change was too dramatic, but these were unpopular views. The Whig Party was in power at this point. Charles Grey was the Prime Minister who implemented this Great Reform Act, but he retired in July 1834 to be replaced by William Lamb, another Whig. And we have episodes on both of those Prime Ministers already. William Lamb took over in July 1834, but by November of the same year, King William IV demanded change, being tired of the Whigs' reforms and hoping to put the Tories back in power. It's the last time that a king of the country has wielded his power in this way. He briefly put Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, back into office, but in a matter of weeks the Duke ceded his premiership to Robert Peel. This was an unstable situation, however, and when a general election was called in February 1835 to sort out this mess, the Whigs returned to office, with William Lamb as the Premier once again. So Robert Peel's first premiership didn't have time to take hold, lasting barely 4 months. Another consequence of these tumultuous times, however, was that the Conservative Party can be said to have been founded during these days, with Peel said to have been its original founder. It was due to the Tory or Conservative lack of support for the Great Reform Act that the party had undergone an existential change. Peel, as leader of the party, had to put together a Conservative response to this crisis. There was a circle he had to square, being against the Reform Act and yet making it clear that he wouldn't revoke such a popular act. Peel's masterstroke was to put together a Conservative response that made sense. He argued that he'd seen the effects of rebellion in both France and Ireland, and wasn't actually against electoral reform per se. He argued that such reform must be very difficult because of the unknown forces it could unleash. Hence, change should only take place from a conservative viewpoint to make sure that society's foundations remained intact. Now in opposition, but wanting to gain power again, Peel put together the first ever political manifesto, promising not to repeal the Reform Act, but insisting that the line should be drawn there. In short, there should be no further changes to the voting system other than to resolve genuine issues that arose incrementally. Throughout it all, Peel was interested in conserving the status quo, meaning protecting the wealth of the landowners and men such as his father. And his argument was that if this should mean giving extra rights to the workers every so often, so be it. So here we've already uncovered some of the achievements of Robert Peel. He set up the police force, he created the first political manifesto, and is credited with forming the Conservative Party as it still exists today, more or less. However, he would have another time as Prime Minister, so how did he become Prime Minister a second time? So Peel was swept out of office and William Lamb was back in power, and he was much more relaxed about reform, recognising that many reforms had taken place and there was just no more appetite in the country for further changes. Because of this attitude, he actually remained in the job much longer than had initially been expected. This time also coincided with a new Queen, Queen Victoria. However, this led to an early controversy in the Queen's reign. The constitutional Queen was supposed to, by definition more or less, be politically neutral when it came to Prime Ministers in particular. However, Peel didn't approve of the Queen's close friendship with William Lamb, and when he announced that he wanted to resign as Prime Minister in 1839, heads turned to the Conservative opposition to see if they would form a government with Peel at its head. However, the numbers didn't work well for the opposition, and Peel was reluctant to form another minority government as he had done last time. He said he would only do it with the explicit support of the Queen. To show her support, she would have to change her staff, who he thought were too well connected to the Whig Party. The Queen, however, controversially, chose not to do Peel's bidding, leading to what's been called the bedchamber crisis. Peel refused to lead another government and waited until the next general election in 1841, when finally the Whig Party was swept out of office and the Conservatives, as they were now called, entered office finally with a majority. Peel's premiership had firm foundations. What were Peel's achievements during his second premiership? He became Prime Minister for the second time during a moment of crisis for the country. Peel set about resolving the country's financial issues and making sure that the reforms of the previous decade bedded in without causing too much distress for the wealthy. For a generation or two, the working class would have to be happy with such reforms as had already been given. However, Peel made more concessions. He reintroduced income tax, for example, but made it clear that the wealthiest should be the ones who contributed most. Why should they do this? Well, his argument was that this was a way of preserving the social order, which included keeping the wealthiest as the wealthiest, but made it explicitly clear that they were willing to contribute to the greater good. Similarly, Peel reduced taxes on essential items such as food. It was part of the same conservative agenda to maintain social stability. If there were no taxes on food, the government couldn't be blamed for the high prices. Peel had read the public mood, but the solutions he was offering were within a conservative framework. His biggest idea was that big changes weren't needed, but some issues did need to be addressed. Due to the changes he made, Chartism declined and the threat of social instability subsided. Why did Robert Peel stop being Prime Minister? Well, anyone who knows the history of the time will know that the Corn Laws are going to crop up at some point. These laws, which put taxes on grain, were devastating for the poor in Ireland and elsewhere, but things came to a head when the potato famine began to ravage Ireland in 1845. As well as leading to the death and emigration of thousands, if not millions, the Corn Laws split the Conservative Party and led to the end of Peel's premiership. The Corn Laws imposed this tax on grains, and Peel himself opposed any tax on such a basic commodity. However, the landowners benefited from this tax, and the Conservative Party was the party of the landowners. This led to two arguments on the Conservative side of politics, which ended up splitting the party. On the one hand, the Corn Laws should remain because change should be driven from the top, not the bottom. In this way, people will know that they cannot force the hand of the government, and in this way, stability would be maintained. In Peel's opinion, this was wrong, particularly when concerned with something as basic as food. In these circumstances, changes had to be made, or the government would be viewed by the people as the enemy, which could lead to instability. In these circumstances, Peel argued, making change was, ultimately, a conservative act, because it would conserve the status quo. Using these arguments, Peel repealed the Corn Laws, but he only managed to do this with the support of the opposition. Now, as soon as this happens, you've lost. Peel had lost the confidence of his own party, and then the opposition, as soon as this issue was over, returned to their default opposition, where they were also against Peel. He lost the premiership because of his principles, with his own party turning against him. But because of this, he became something of a hero, fighting for the working class against the landowners. That's one view. Another one would point out that his whole aim, ultimately, had been to preserve the current system of aristocracy and landowners, so opinions here can vary depending on your own politics. Why should we remember Robert Peel? Due to his sensitivity to the French Revolution and discontent in Ireland, Peel's whole political philosophy revolved around making sure something similar didn't happen in England. Social order was his main aim, reflected in his creation of the police and his repeal of the Corn Laws. It gives him a somewhat ambiguous reputation, which can depend on your own politics. But his philosophy is nevertheless one that still lives on in the current Conservative Party. One that assumes that the current social order is worth maintaining at all costs, and that things can be improved incrementally rather than with drastic change. Frankly, over the years this philosophy has worked, if only in the fact that the Conservative Party has been around now for almost 2 centuries. Robert Peel might be a hero, one who forged a form of conservatism that allowed for some change, but at the same time gave the country a stability that lasted for decades if not centuries. He's a hero because he created the police force and because he ended the Corn Laws. Or perhaps he was the opposite of a hero, a man who recognised that change would happen, but made sure that it happened on the terms that would keep the current system in place. Political opinions, as always, will vary. Thank you for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you did, please do give it a like before you move on, and please share it with anyone who might be interested. We really appreciate it when you do, to help promote Long History and Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Don't forget there's many more episodes to explore on your podcast provider, with pretty much every period now covered, although there are still many Prime Ministers to go. Thank you for listening to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 24, Robert Peel. Bobby. Goodbye.